April 15th, 1815, 10:47 p.m. Lady Hastings Spring Ball. The chandeliers cast their golden glow across the crowded ballroom, illuminating silk gowns that swirled like butterfly wings across the polished floor. While Margaret Ashworth sat precisely where she had been sitting for the past 3 hours, her lavender silk dress arranged carefully around her on the gilt chair that had become as familiar as her own bed. She watched the dancers with the practiced detachment of one who had long ago accepted her role as perpetual observer, her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap, her spine straight despite the ache that had settled between her shoulder blades from maintaining perfect posture for so long. The music swelled and ebbed, a waltz giving way to a country dance, and still she sat, counting the roses on the wallpaper behind the musicians. Having already memorized every face in the room, every jewel that sparkled at every throat, every laugh that rang out above the music. Her mother had long since abandoned her post beside her daughter, drawn away by Mrs. Whitmore to discuss the shocking price of French lace, leaving Margaret to her familiar solitude, a solitude she wore like armor against the pitying glances that occasionally drifted her way. She had perfected the art of appearing serene, of seeming contentedly absorbed in the spectacle before her, when in truth she was counting the minutes until they could politely take their leave. It was then that she heard his voice, cutting through the music and chatter like a blade through silk. That distinctive baritone that commanded attention in any room, Alexander Pembroke, Duke of Ravenscroft, standing not 10 feet away with a group of gentlemen, his black evening wear impeccable, his bearing aristocratic and somewhat intimidating. "I do believe Miss Ashworth has taken root in that corner," he said, his tone carrying that particular blend of amusement and disdain that only the very wealthy and very bored could perfect. "One wonders if she has been there so long that vines have begun to grow up the chair legs." The laughter that followed his observation was polite but genuine, the kind of laughter that comes at another's expense, and Margaret felt her cheeks burn beneath the powder her mother had insisted upon. "Perhaps we should water her," another gentleman suggested, clearly encouraged by the Duke's jest, "though I dare say nothing could make that particular flower bloom." The Duke's lips curved in a smile that did not reach his eyes, those famous grey eyes that society matrons declared could freeze or melt a woman with equal efficiency. "Now, Harrington, that is unkind," he drawled, though his tone suggested he found the comment more amusing than offensive. "Miss Ashworth serves a vital purpose at these gatherings. Without her steadfast presence in that corner, how would we know where to direct the young ladies who have failed to secure partners? She is rather like a lighthouse for the socially shipwrecked." Margaret's hands clenched in her lap, her carefully maintained composure beginning to crack as each word landed like a small, precise blow against her dignity, against the walls she had built around her heart. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. The cool night air hit Margaret's heated face like a blessing as she pushed through the French doors onto the garden terrace, her lavender silk rustling with each hurried step away from the ballroom and those cruel, cutting words that still echoed in her ears. She gripped the stone balustrade with trembling fingers, breathing in the scent of night-blooming jasmine while trying to calm the storm of humiliation and anger that threatened to overwhelm her carefully constructed composure. The music from the ballroom drifted out through the open doors, a mocking reminder of the world she had fled, when footsteps on the flagstones behind her made her spine stiffen. "Running away from your lighthouse duties, Miss Ashworth?" The Duke's voice was closer than she expected, lacking the sharp edge it had carried inside, but maintaining that incomparable tone of amusement. Margaret did not turn, could not trust herself to face him without revealing the tears that threatened to spill. I thought perhaps the socially shipwrecked might benefit from navigating without my beacon for a while, Your Grace, she said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. How considerate of you, he replied, moving to stand beside her at the balustrade, his presence both imposing and oddly magnetic in the moonlight. Though I confess myself surprised to find you capable of abandoning your post. I had begun to think you were indeed rooted to that chair. The anger that had been simmering beneath her hurt suddenly flared hot and bright. And I had begun to think that a man of your supposed intelligence might find more stimulating entertainment than mocking those he deems beneath him, Margaret said, finally turning to face him, her chin raised despite the tears that made her eyes glitter in the moonlight. But perhaps I overestimated the depths of ducal wit. His eyebrows rose at her words, those grey eyes studying her with an intensity that made her want to step back, though she held her ground. My word, he murmured. The wallflower has thorns. Margaret felt a bitter laugh escape her. Did you think that because I sit quietly, because I do not simper and flutter my fan at every eligible gentleman, that I am without feeling? That your words would not wound simply because I am accustomed to being overlooked? She saw something shift in his expression, a flicker of what might have been discomfort or even shame. I spoke thoughtlessly, he said after a moment, his voice losing its mocking quality. That is beneath me as both a gentleman and as someone who should know better than to judge by appearances alone. The admission surprised her enough that some of her anger cooled. An apology, Your Grace? From the man who just compared me to a garden fixture? He had the grace to look genuinely chagrined. You are right to censure me, Miss Ashworth. I have behaved abominably. He paused, studying her face in the silver moonlight with an expression she could not quite read. May I ask you something? Why do you attend these gatherings if they bring you no joy? Margaret considered dismissing him, returning to the ballroom and her familiar chair, but something in his manner, some genuine curiosity beneath the aristocratic veneer, made her stay. Because I am 26 years old, Your Grace, and unmarried, because my mother still harbors hope that someday someone might see past my plain face and quiet manner to offer for me, because despite knowing better, some small part of me still hopes she might be right. She turned away again, embarrassed by her honesty. Though after 6 years of sitting in corners at balls, one would think I would have learned better. April 16th, 1815, 7:30 a.m., the morning light filtered through the kitchen garden windows as Margaret Ashworth knelt among her roses, her hands working mechanically to deadhead the spent blooms, while her mind remained trapped in the previous evening's encounter on Lady Hastings' terrace. The familiar ritual of tending her garden usually brought peace, but today each snip of her pruning shears seemed to echo with the Duke of Ravenscroft's words, both his initial cruelty and his unexpected apology tangling together in her thoughts like the thorns that occasionally caught at her morning dress. She had barely slept, spending the dark hours reliving that strange conversation, the way his grey eyes had studied her in the moonlight, the genuine surprise in his voice when she had spoken back to him with such uncharacteristic boldness. Here in her garden, surrounded by plants that responded to care and attention without judgment, she could almost convince herself the entire exchange had been a dream, except for the way her heart still raced when she recalled his admission of behaving abominably. Meanwhile, across London in the breakfast room of Pembroke House, Alexander Pembroke stared unseeing at his morning newspaper, the words blurring before him as he found himself thinking, yet again, of lavender silk and eyes that had sparkled with unshed tears in the moonlight. His coffee had grown cold in its delicate porcelain cup, untouched as he replayed their conversation for what must have been the 100th time since returning home. He had built his reputation on wit and carefully maintained distance, on never allowing anyone close enough to truly matter, yet somehow Margaret Ashworth had slipped past his defences with her quiet dignity and unexpected fire. Philip Harrington's jest about watering her to make her bloom now seemed not merely unkind but profoundly ignorant, for Alexander had seen her bloom last night, had watched her transform from silent wallflower to avenging angel in the space of a heartbeat, and the image would not leave him be. His valet had already commented on his unusual restlessness this morning, the way he had dismissed 3 perfectly acceptable cravat arrangements before settling on a 4th, as if his appearance mattered when he had no plans to venture out. But that was the crux of it, was it not? He found himself wanting to venture out, wanting to seek her out, to continue their conversation and discover what other surprises Margaret Ashworth might reveal. The thought disturbed him more than he cared to admit. This sudden fascination with a woman he had dismissed so carelessly, a woman who had shown him a mirror to his own behavior and found him wanting. Back in her garden, Margaret rose from her knees, brushing the soil from her skirts as she heard her mother calling from the house about breakfast, and she wondered if the Duke had given their encounter another thought, or if she had been merely a moment's diversion, a brief entertainment before he returned to his world of privilege and beauty, where plain women who sat alone at balls were nothing more than convenient targets for clever quips and social commentary. April 18th, 1815, at precisely 2 in the afternoon, the Ashworth household was thrown into complete disarray by the arrival of a caller whose identity sent Lady Catherine Ashworth into such a state of shock that she nearly dropped her embroidery hoop entirely, the silk threads tangling as she rushed to the window to confirm what their butler had just announced with barely contained excitement. The Duke of Ravenscroft stood in their modest drawing-room, his imposing figure making the familiar space seem suddenly smaller, his perfectly tailored coat and gleaming boots a stark contrast to the comfortable but decidedly unfashionable furnishings that Margaret had never before found lacking. Margaret herself, having been summoned from her small study where she had been reading, entered the room to find her mother already deep in a curtsy that threatened to topple her elaborate morning cap, while the Duke stood near the fireplace, his grey eyes finding hers immediately with an intensity that made her heart skip in a most alarming manner. "Your Grace," she managed, dropping into her own curtsy while trying to understand why he was here, in her home, looking at her as if she were a puzzle he was determined to solve. "Miss Ashworth," he replied, his voice carrying none of the mockery from their first encounter, instead holding something that sounded almost like uncertainty. "I hope you will forgive my calling without proper introduction, but I found myself unable to wait for the usual social mechanisms to arrange what I hope will be the first of many conversations." Lady Catherine made a sound somewhere between a gasp and a squeak, her eyes darting between her daughter and the Duke as if trying to comprehend this unprecedented situation, before years of social training kicked in and she managed to invite His Grace to sit, calling frantically for tea while shooting. Margaret looks that clearly demanded an immediate explanation that her daughter could not possibly provide. "I trust your roses are recovering from their pruning, Miss Ashworth," the Duke said once they were seated, his comment causing Margaret to start slightly, wondering how he could possibly know about her morning gardening, until she noticed the faint scratch on her hand from a thorn, which she quickly covered with her other hand. "They are quite resilient, Your Grace," she replied, aware of her mother's confused expression, but unable to explain the strange intimacy of discussing her private morning ritual with this man who should not even know she existed beyond their brief encounter on a moonlit terrace. The tea arrived with remarkable speed, their cook having apparently abandoned whatever she had been preparing to produce their finest cakes and biscuits, arranged on the good china that was usually reserved for Christmas and Easter, while Lady Catherine poured with hands that trembled only slightly as she tried to make sense of the impossible scene before her. "I owe your daughter an apology, Lady Ashworth," the Duke said suddenly, causing Margaret's mother to nearly overflow the teacup she was filling. And I hoped to make it properly, in the light of day, without the influence of champagne or the excuse of a crowded ballroom. Margaret felt heat rise to her cheeks as her mother's gaze sharpened, clearly desperate to know what had transpired that required a ducal apology. But the Duke's attention remained fixed on Margaret herself, those grey eyes holding a warmth she had not expected to see there, making her wonder if perhaps she had not been merely a moment's diversion after all, if perhaps their strange encounter had haunted his thoughts as thoroughly as it had consumed hers. April 20th, 1815, at 3:30 in the afternoon, Margaret Ashworth sat frozen in Lady Pemberton's drawing-room, her teacup trembling slightly in her hand as Lady Diana Sinclair held court with her latest piece of gossip, her voice carrying that particular tone of delighted malice that made Margaret's stomach turn with familiar dread. "Can you imagine?" Lady Diana was saying, her fan fluttering dramatically as she leaned forward to ensure every lady present caught each scandalous word. The Duke of Ravenscroft calling upon the Ashworth household, and not just leaving his card, mind you, but actually staying for tea with that peculiar daughter of theirs who never speaks at parties. And Margaret felt every eye in the room turn toward her, with expressions ranging from disbelief to poorly concealed amusement. Mrs. Hartwell tittered behind her glove, adding, "Perhaps he lost a wager, poor man. Though what gentleman would be so cruel as to demand such a forfeit?" While Lady Pemberton herself maintained a neutral expression that somehow managed to convey both sympathy and superiority. Margaret's mother, seated beside her, had gone quite pale, her fingers twisting in her lap as she attempted to maintain her composure in the face of such unaffected attention. For they had both known the Duke's visit would not remain secret, but had not anticipated the speed with which the news would travel or the creative interpretations it would spawn. "I heard," continued another voice, Mrs. Whitmore this time, "that Miss Ashworth has been practicing dark arts, perhaps slipping potions into the Duke's champagne at the Hastings Ball," which prompted a wave of laughter that made Margaret's cheeks burn with humiliation, even as she kept her gaze fixed on her teacup, watching the amber liquid ripple with each tremor of her hands. Lady Diana was not finished, her eyes glittering with the pleasure of being the center of attention as she delivered what she clearly considered the coup de grace. "My maid heard from the Ashworth scullery girl that his Grace appeared quite distracted, even confused, leading one to wonder if perhaps he had suffered some sort of mental disturbance. For what other explanation could there be for such an extraordinary lapse in judgment?" The cruelty of it all washed over Margaret like a familiar tide. The same dismissive contempt she had endured for years, now sharpened by the brief hope the Duke's visit had kindled, and she wondered if Alexander Pembroke had any idea what his simple social call had unleashed upon her. Meanwhile, across town at his club, Alexander was enduring his own version of social interrogation as Philip Harrington and several other gentlemen pressed him for an explanation of his unprecedented visit to what Harrington termed the most forgettable family in London, their curiosity barely masking their incredulity that he would waste his time on such an unpromising quarter. "Come now, Ravenscroft," Lord Belmont was saying with a knowing smirk. "Surely you can enlighten us as to what hidden charms the Ashworth chit possesses that drew the most eligible duke in England to her modest drawing-room." But Alexander merely raised an eyebrow and continued reading his newspaper, his silence only fueling their speculation further as they began constructing increasingly outlandish theories that ranged from secret fortunes to mysterious French connections, never once considering that perhaps Margaret Ashworth might simply be worth knowing for herself alone. April 22nd, 1815, at 11 in the morning, the familiar musty scent of leather bindings and fresh paper enveloped Margaret as she entered Hatchard's bookshop on Piccadilly, seeking refuge from the social torment of the past days in the one place where she had always found solace, her fingers trailing along the spines of volumes that promised escape into worlds where wallflowers could become heroines and where worth was measured by character rather than beauty or social standing. She had deliberately chosen this hour, knowing most of society would still be abed after their late-night entertainments, hoping to avoid any further encounters with those who found such amusement in dissecting the Duke of Ravenscroft's inexplicable visit to her home, and so it was with considerable shock that she rounded the corner into the poetry section to find the very man who had become the source of so much speculation standing there, a volume of Byron in his hands, his grey eyes lifting to meet hers with what appeared to be genuine pleasure. "Miss Ashworth," he said, closing the book carefully and offering a bow that managed to be both proper and somehow intimate in the narrow aisle between the shelves. "What an unexpected delight to find a kindred spirit among the stacks, though I confess I should not be surprised to discover you here, given our previous discussion of literature on a certain moonlit terrace." Margaret felt her heart begin that now familiar rapid rhythm his presence seemed to provoke, but she managed to maintain her composure as she replied, "Your Grace, I had not thought to find anyone from society haunting a bookshop at such an unfashionable hour, particularly not someone of your elevated position who surely has more pressing demands upon his time." His smile transformed his austere features into something almost boyish as he gestured to the book in his hand, saying, "Ah, but you see, Miss Ashworth, I find myself in desperate need of new reading material, having exhausted my library's offerings in recent restless nights when sleep proves elusive and one's thoughts turn repeatedly to conversations that end too soon and encounters that leave one questioning everything one thought one knew about the world." The implication in his words made Margaret's cheeks warm, but before she could respond, he had moved closer, close enough that she could detect the subtle scent of his cologne mingling with the bookshop's atmospheric perfume, and asked, "What brings you to seek sanctuary among the poets today? Or dare I hope you might be persuaded to guide me toward something more substantial than Lord Byron's melodrama?" She found herself relaxing despite the impropriety of their unchaperoned meeting. Something about the reverent way he handled the books and the genuine interest in his expression making her forget her usual guardedness as she led him toward the philosophy section, explaining, "I find Wollstonecraft's vindication particularly compelling when one has recently been reminded of society's narrow definitions of female worth, though I suspect such radical thoughts might shock a duke who moves in more conventional circles." His laugh was low and appreciative as he selected the very volume she had indicated, his fingers brushing hers as he took it from the shelf, the brief contact sending an unexpected shiver through her as he said, "On the contrary, Miss Ashworth, I find myself increasingly drawn to those who challenge convention, who possess the courage to think beyond the suffocating confines of what society deems acceptable, who might, perhaps, teach a man grown too comfortable in his elevated position that there are treasures to be found in the most unexpected places." And the way his eyes held hers as he spoke made it abundantly clear that he was not speaking merely of books. April 28th, 1815, at 9:30 in the evening, Margaret Ashworth stood at the entrance to Lord and Lady Thornhill's ballroom, her fingers nervously smoothing the blue silk of her gown, a dress her mother had insisted upon, despite Margaret's protests that it would only draw unwanted attention to her altered circumstances, though she had to admit the colour did something extraordinary to her complexion, bringing out the warmth in her brown eyes that she had never noticed before. The past week had been a whirlwind of emotions since her encounter with Alexander at the bookshop, their stolen hour among the shelves replaying in her mind during sleepless nights, making her question everything she had believed about her place in the world and her resigned acceptance of perpetual invisibility. Yet here she stood, entering another ballroom where she would surely resume her familiar position along the wall, watching others dance and laugh while she counted the minutes until acceptable departure. The whispers began the moment she crossed the threshold, heads turning and fans raising to hide gossiping mouths as news of her presence rippled through the assembled company like waves across a pond. And she heard fragments of conversation that included the Duke's peculiar interest, and above her station, and temporary madness, each phrase a tiny dart finding its mark in her already fragile confidence. She had nearly reached her usual refuge near the potted palms when the crowd seemed to part like the Red Sea, and there stood Alexander Pembroke, Duke of Ravenscroft, resplendent in perfectly tailored black evening wear that emphasized his commanding height and broad shoulders, his grey eyes finding hers across the space with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. He moved toward her with purposeful strides that brooked no interference, ignoring the attempts of several young ladies to catch his attention, including the beautiful Lady Constance Fairfax, who actually stepped directly into his path, only to have him sidestep her with barely a glance, his focus never wavering from Margaret's increasingly flushed face. "Miss Ashworth," he said when he reached her, bowing deeply in a gesture of respect that drew audible gasps from nearby observers. "I have been searching for you since the moment I arrived, though I confess I feared you might have chosen to avoid such gatherings after the unconscionable gossip that has plagued you this past week, gossip for which I hold myself entirely responsible." Before she could form a response to this unexpected apology, the opening notes of a waltz filled the air, and Alexander extended his hand to her with a smile that transformed his usually austere features into something almost tender, saying, "Would you do me the extraordinary honor of dancing with me, Miss Ashworth, and perhaps we might give society something truly worth discussing?" The entire ballroom seemed to hold its collective breath as Margaret stared at his outstretched hand, knowing that to accept would irrevocably change everything, would place her at the center of attention she had spent years avoiding, would link her name with his in ways that could never be undone. Yet as she looked into his eyes and saw not mockery or pity, but genuine desire for her company, she found herself placing her trembling fingers in his and allowing him to lead her onto the dance floor where no partner had ever sought her before, the crowd parting in stunned silence as the Duke of Ravenscroft, the most eligible bachelor in London, took the perpetual wallflower Margaret Ashworth into his arms and began to waltz. April 29th, Tamar 1815, at 45 minutes past 5 in the morning, Margaret Ashworth knelt in her garden among the earliest spring roses, her hands working mechanically to remove spent blooms, while her mind replayed every moment of the previous evening's ball, the weight of Alexander's gaze, the warmth of his hand at her waist as they waltzed, the shocked expressions of society matrons who could not comprehend why the Duke of Ravenscroft would single out the invisible Miss Ashworth for such marked attention. The morning mist clung to the garden like a gossamer veil, droplets of dew catching the first rays of dawn light, and she had sought refuge here in the one place where she had always felt most herself, most at peace, away from the suffocating expectations and cruel judgments of a world that had never quite known what to do with her. She had barely slept, her mind too full of questions and doubts, wondering if perhaps she had dreamed the entire evening, if Alexander's attention would prove as fleeting as morning dew once the novelty of shocking society had worn off. And she pressed her fingers into the cool earth, seeking something solid and real to anchor her tumultuous emotions. The sound of footsteps on the gravel path made her freeze, for no one should be about at this hour, and she turned to find Alexander himself standing at the garden gate, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled, his coat missing, his white shirt damp with morning mist, his face bearing an expression of such raw desperation that her breath caught in her throat. "Margaret," he said, and the use of her given name without permission or pretense sent a shock through her entire being. "Forgive me for this unconscionable intrusion, but I could not wait another moment, could not bear another hour of pretense and propriety when every fiber of my being demands I speak the truth that has been consuming me since that night on the terrace." He moved into the garden with uncertain steps, so different from his usual commanding presence, and she watched in growing amazement as this proud duke, this man who commanded respect and deference wherever he went, suddenly dropped to his knees in the damp earth before her, his grey eyes lifting to meet hers with an vulnerability that made her heart clench. "I have been a fool," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "A blind, arrogant fool who mocked what he did not understand, who failed to see the treasure that sat before him week after week, year after year, and now I find myself brought low by the very woman I once dismissed, unable to think of anything but you, unable to imagine a future that does not include your voice, your thoughts, your presence in my life." His hands reached for hers, still dirty from the garden soil, and he held them as if they were precious beyond measure, continuing. "I know I have no right to ask this, no right to hope after beginning so badly. But Margaret, dearest Margaret, I am desperately, hopelessly, completely in love with you, and if you could find it in your generous heart to forgive my initial cruelty, to consider the possibility that a man can change, can learn, can discover that everything he thought mattered pales in comparison to the light in your eyes when you speak of books and ideas and dreams, then perhaps you might consent to be my Duchess, my companion, my salvation from a life that was empty long before I knew what I was missing." And as the first full rays of sunlight broke through the morning mist, illuminating his upturned face and the tears that tracked down his cheeks, Margaret felt her carefully constructed walls crumble entirely, her own tears falling as she realized that this proud man was offering not just his title and position, but his very heart, kneeling in her simple garden at dawn like a supplicant before the only altar that truly mattered. April 29th, 1815, at 8 in the morning. The sound of shattering china echoed through the Ashworth breakfast room as Lady Catherine dropped her teacup upon seeing her daughter enter through the garden door with soil-stained hands and tear-tracked cheeks, followed by none other than the Duke of Ravenscroft himself, whose presence in their home at such an unconscionable hour could mean only scandal or salvation, though from the expression on Margaret's face, her mother could not determine which. Lord Thomas Ashworth lowered his morning paper with deliberate slowness, his weathered face betraying no emotion, save for a slight tightening around his eyes as he took in the dishevelled state of both his daughter and their illustrious visitor, the Duke's knees bearing telltale grass stains and damp patches that spoke of activities far removed from proper morning calls. "Your Grace," Lord Ashworth said with careful neutrality, rising from his chair as protocol demanded, despite the highly irregular circumstances, "while we are honoured by your presence, I must confess some concern at finding you in our garden with my daughter at an hour when most of society remains abed, and in a state that suggests activities of a most unusual nature." Alexander stepped forward, placing himself slightly in front of Margaret in a protective gesture that did not go unnoticed by either parent, his grey eyes meeting Lord Ashworth's with unflinching directness as he replied, "Lord Ashworth, Lady Ashworth, I owe you both an explanation and an apology for this breach of propriety. But I must tell you that what you have witnessed is merely a man who has discovered too late what truly matters in life, and who could not wait another moment to declare himself to your daughter." Lady Catherine had recovered enough to ring for a servant to clear the broken china, her voice carefully modulated as she said, Perhaps we might all sit down and discuss this in a civilized manner, though I confess myself at a loss to understand what possible interest a duke could have in Margaret, who has never shown the slightest inclination toward attracting such elevated attention." The casual dismissal in her mother's tone made Margaret flinch, but before she could speak, Alexander's voice cut through the room with quiet authority. "With respect, Lady Ashworth, your daughter possesses qualities that far exceed the superficial accomplishments society values in young women, including an intelligence and depth of character that would grace any home, any title, any position in society, and I count myself fortunate beyond measure that she has not immediately refused my suit despite my unconscionable behavior at our first meeting." Lord Ashworth's eyebrows rose at this admission, and he studied the Duke with renewed interest before turning his attention to his daughter, who stood with her chin raised despite her obvious emotional state, saying, "Margaret, my dear, perhaps you might enlighten us as to the nature of His Grace's declaration and your response to it, for I find myself quite unprepared for this turn of events." Margaret's voice trembled slightly, but gained strength as she spoke. "Mother, the Duke has honored me with an offer of marriage, made in perhaps the most unconventional manner imaginable, but with a sincerity that I cannot doubt, though I have given no answer, as I felt you deserved to know of this development before any decision could be made." Lady Catherine's sharp intake of breath preceded her words. "Marriage to a duke, Margaret, you cannot be serious in considering such a thing, for you must know that society will never accept it, that you will be mocked and ridiculed, that women like Lady Diana Sinclair will make your life a misery with their cutting remarks and social exclusion." But Alexander interrupted with a firmness that brooked no argument. "Any person who would dare to slight my Duchess would find themselves permanently excluded from every drawing-room of consequence in London, and I suspect that once society sees how I treasure and honor my wife, they will quickly learn to value what they have previously overlooked." May 2nd, 1815, at 4 in the afternoon, Margaret walked slowly through the rose garden behind Ashworth House, her fingers trailing along the blooming bushes that had witnessed Alexander's desperate declaration 3 days prior, their petals now fully opened in the warm spring sunshine that seemed to mock the turmoil in her heart. For despite the intervening days of family discussions, carefully worded letters, and her mother's alternating fits of excitement and dire warnings, she still found herself unable to fully believe that the Duke of Ravenscroft truly wished to bind his life to hers. The sound of familiar footsteps on the gravel path made her turn, and there stood Alexander. More formally dressed than during his dawn visit, but with the same intensity in his grey eyes that had haunted her dreams, his hands clasped behind his back, as if restraining himself from reaching for her, and she noticed how the afternoon light caught the threads of silver at his temples, making him appear both distinguished and somehow vulnerable. "Your father has given his consent," he said without preamble, his voice carefully controlled. Though not without expressing his concerns about the differences in our stations and the potential for society's censure, concerns I have attempted to address, though I suspect only time will truly ease his worries. But, Margaret, I find I must know your heart in this matter, for all the permissions in the world mean nothing if you do not wish for this union." She turned to face him fully, seeing the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw tightened as he waited for her response, and she realized with sudden clarity that this powerful duke, this man who could have any woman in England, stood before her in genuine fear of her refusal, his pride and position set aside in favor of raw honesty. "I have spent 3 days attempting to convince myself that this is merely a dream from which I shall soon wake," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "That a duke could not possibly want a woman who has been overlooked and dismissed for so many years, who brings no great beauty or accomplishment to recommend her, who has grown comfortable in her solitude and her books, and may not know how to be what you require in a duchess." Alexander moved closer, his control finally breaking as his hands came up to gently cup her face. His thumbs chose, brushing away tears she had not realized were falling. My dearest Margaret, do you not yet understand that it is precisely because you are not like other women that I find myself so completely captivated by you? That your intelligence, your quiet strength, your refusal to simper and pretend have shown me what I have been missing all these years in the hollow pageantry of society. His voice grew more urgent as he continued, I do not want a decorative duchess who will smile vapidly at dinner parties and concern herself only with fashion and gossip. I want a companion, a partner, someone who will challenge my thoughts and share my interests, who will help me raise children with substance and character rather than mere polish. And in you I have found all of this and more, if only you will trust me enough to take this leap. Margaret felt the last of her walls crumbling as she looked into his eyes and saw not the cold, mocking Duke who had first caught her attention, but a man offering his whole heart without reservation, and she whispered, I am afraid, Alexander, afraid that I will disappoint you, that society will never accept me, that you will come to regret choosing someone so far beneath what the world expects for you. But he silenced her with the gentlest press of his fingers against her lips, saying, Then we shall be afraid together, but we shall also be brave together, and I promise you that any regret I might feel will only be for the years we have wasted not knowing each other, for the time I spent blind to the treasure that was always before me. And as he dropped to one knee among the roses, pulling out a ring that caught the afternoon sunlight with brilliant fire, he asked with formal solemnity touched by desperate hope, Miss Margaret Ashworth, will you do me the immeasurable honor of becoming my wife, my duchess, my dearest companion for all the days that remain to us? And Margaret, feeling as if her heart might burst from the magnitude of the moment, looked down at this proud man kneeling before her and whispered a single word that would change both their lives forever. Yes. May 3rd, 1815, at 2 in the afternoon, rain drummed steadily against the windows of the private parlour at Ashworth House as Margaret sat across from Alexander, the sapphire engagement ring on her finger, catching the lamplight with every nervous movement of her hands, while he stared into the fire with an expression she had not seen before, sir. A haunted quality that made him appear both older and more vulnerable than she had ever witnessed in their brief but intense courtship. The silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable but weighted with unspoken words, until finally Alexander turned from the fire and met her gaze with those grey eyes that had first mocked her and now held depths of pain she was only beginning to understand, saying quietly, Margaret, before we proceed further with our engagement, before you bind yourself irrevocably to me, there are things about my past that you deserve to know, truths that may change your opinion of me, and that I have been cowardly in not sharing sooner. She leaned forward slightly, her voice gentle but firm as she replied, Whatever you wish to tell me, Alexander, I am here to listen without judgment, for I believe that our past, however painful, have shaped us into the people who found each other in that ballroom, and I would know all of you, not merely the parts you choose to show society. He rose abruptly and moved to the window, watching the rain streak down the glass as he began to speak, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. I was married before, as you know, to Lady Rosalind Fairfax, a match that society deemed perfect in every way, for she was beautiful, accomplished, from an impeccable family, everything a future duke should desire in a bride, and I was young enough and foolish enough to believe that such surface perfections would ensure happiness. The pain in his voice made Margaret's heart ache, but she remained silent, understanding that this confession had been building inside him for years and needed to be released in its own time. As he continued, "We married with great fanfare, the wedding of the season they called it, and for perhaps 3 months I believed myself content, until I began to realize that beneath her perfect exterior lay a soul as cold and calculating as any I have ever encountered, interested only in my title, my wealth, my position, viewing me not as a husband but as a means to social prominence." His hands clenched behind his back as the words poured forth like water through a broken dam. "She took lovers within 6 months of our marriage, barely troubling to hide her indiscretions, knowing that my pride and the scandal of divorce would keep me silent, and when I finally confronted her, she laughed and told me I was naive to expect fidelity when she had given me what she owed, an heir to carry on the precious Pembroke line. Though even that duty she resented, and made clear she would never allow my touch again once she had provided the requisite son." Margaret rose and moved toward him, her heart breaking for the young man he had been, but he held up a hand to stop her approach, not finished with his painful revelation. "When she died in that carriage accident 5 years ago, society expected me to mourn, to play the grieving widower, and I did. But Margaret, my shame is that what I mourned was not her loss, but the years I had wasted, the capacity for love I feared she had killed in me, the bitter certainty that all women were merely better or worse actresses hiding the same mercenary hearts beneath pretty faces." The rain intensified, as if nature itself responded to his anguish, and when he finally turned to face her, tears stood unshed in his eyes as he whispered, "Then I saw you sitting alone at that ball, scorned by the same society that had praised my perfect bride, and in my bitterness I mocked you. But when you turned those honest eyes on me, and spoke with such dignity and intelligence, when you refused to simper or lie or play the games I had come to expect, something in me that I thought long dead began to wake. And these past weeks, Margaret, you have shown me that true beauty lies not in surface perfections, but in depth of character, not in social graces, but in genuine kindness, not in calculating charm, but in authentic feeling. And I find myself terrified that I have forgotten how to love properly, that the wounds Rosalind left have made me incapable of being the husband you deserve." May 8th, 1815, at 8 in the evening. Margaret stood frozen at the entrance to the Duke of Ravenscroft's opera box, her heart hammering against the stays of her new evening gown as hundreds of eyes turned to witness her arrival, the weight of society's scrutiny pressing down upon her like a physical force, while Alexander's warm hand at her elbow provided the only anchor in a sea of whispered speculation and barely concealed shock. The crimson silk of her gown, chosen by Alexander himself during a mortifying visit to the modiste where he had overruled her protests about the expense with gentle firmness, felt like armor and target both as she forced herself to walk forward with her chin raised, though she could hear the ripple of gossip spreading through the theatre like wildfire, Lady Diana Sinclair's voice carrying above the rest as she exclaimed to her companion about the Duke's inexplicable choice of bride. Alexander guided her to the front of the box with deliberate ceremony, his own evening dress impeccable as always, but she could feel the tension in him through the light touch of his fingers, the protective way he positioned himself slightly behind her as if shielding her from the worst of the stares. And when he helped her into her seat, he murmured so only she could hear, "Breathe, my darling, and remember that after tonight, they will have to acknowledge you as my chosen Duchess. Their opinions be damned." The opera began, but Margaret heard none of it. Too aware of the opera glasses trained on their box, the whispered conversations during every pause in the music, the way Lady Pemberton in the adjacent box leaned over to her daughter with obvious commentary about the unsuitability of the match, and Margaret felt her confidence, so carefully built during their private moments, crumbling under the weight of public judgment until Alexander's hand found hers in the darkness, his thumb stroking gently across her knuckles in silent reassurance. During the intermission, when visitors would typically call upon the boxes, Margaret braced herself for either an avalanche of false well-wishers or complete social isolation, but Alexander forestalled both by rising and drawing her with him, announcing with casual authority that they would take some air, and she found herself guided not toward the retiring rooms, but to the grand staircase where they would be most visible. His intention becoming clear as he stopped at the landing where all of society could see them. "Your Grace," called out Mr. Philip Harrington, Alexander's friend, approaching with a warm smile that seemed genuine. "Might I be permitted to congratulate you on your engagement, and to tell Miss Ashworth that she has made my friend happier than I have seen him in years, a transformation that those of us who care for him can only applaud and celebrate." The public endorsement from such a respected figure caused a shift in the atmosphere, and Margaret felt tears prick her eyes as Alexander's grip on her hand tightened with gratitude for his friend's support. But before she could respond, Lord Ashford approached with his wife, both offering their congratulations, with enough volume to be heard by the growing crowd. And suddenly, Margaret understood that Alexander had orchestrated this moment, had called upon his allies to provide the social proof that would begin to turn the tide of opinion. As more people approached, some with genuine warmth and others with calculated politeness, that recognized the new reality of her position, Margaret felt something shift inside her, a realization that while she might never be fully accepted by everyone, she had something more valuable than social approval in the man beside her, who had faced down society's culture to claim her hand, who even now stood like a shield between her and those who would wound her with their words or looks. When they finally returned to their box for the second act, the atmosphere had changed perceptibly, the whispers now tinged with curiosity rather than pure scandal. And as the lights dimmed and the music swelled, Alexander leaned close to whisper, "You were magnificent, my brave. And I have never been prouder to stand beside anyone than I was to stand beside you tonight." And Margaret, feeling the truth of his words wash over her like warm honey, turned to meet his eyes in the darkness, and saw there a love that made all of society's opinions fade to insignificance, understanding in that moment that she had already won the only approval that truly mattered, and that together they were strong enough to weather any storm that jealousy or prejudice might bring against them. May 15th, 1815. At 9 in the evening, Margaret stood at the top of the grand staircase at Pembroke House, her hand resting lightly on Alexander's arm as they prepared to descend into their betrothal ball, the magnificent ballroom below glowing with the light of 1,000 candles that transformed the space into something from a fairy tale. And she could scarcely believe that this celebration was for her, the overlooked spinster, who just 1 month ago had sat alone and forgotten at Lady Hastings' ball. The ivory silk gown she wore, embroidered with seed pearls and silver thread, had been a gift from Alexander's sister Lady Beatrice, who had arrived from Bath specifically for the occasion and had taken Margaret under her wing with a warmth that still brought tears to her eyes, declaring loudly to anyone who would listen that she had despaired of her brother ever finding a woman of sense, and was delighted beyond measure with his choice. As they began their descent, the assembled guests turned as one to watch, and Margaret felt not the crushing weight of scrutiny she had experienced at the opera, but something entirely different, a recognition that she belonged here, that the man beside her had chosen her not despite her supposed inadequacies, but because of the very qualities society had overlooked. And when Alexander paused halfway down to whisper, "You outshine every woman who has ever graced these stairs, my darling," she believed him, for his eyes held nothing but truth and pride. The crowd parted as they reached the ballroom floor, creating a natural path to the centre where they would share the first dance. And Margaret caught glimpses of familiar faces transformed by the circumstances. Lady Catherine Ashworth, dabbing at her eyes with obvious maternal pride, Lord Ashworth standing straighter than she had seen him in years, and even Lady Diana Sinclair forced to offer congratulations through gritted teeth, her power to wound finally neutered by the undeniable reality of the match. The orchestra struck up a waltz, and Alexander drew her into his arms with the same gentle strength he had shown throughout their courtship, leading her through the steps with such grace that she forgot to worry about her footwork, forgot the watching crowd, forgot everything but the sensation of moving in perfect harmony with the man who had seen past society's cruel verdict to the woman beneath. And as they turned and swayed, she heard the murmur of admiration rippling through the room. Comments about how radiant she looked, how perfect they were together, how love had transformed them both. When the dance ended and other couples joined them on the floor, Margaret found herself surrounded by well-wishers, some who had barely acknowledged her existence before, but now seemed eager to claim acquaintance. And while she recognized the fickleness of their approval, she also understood that Alexander had given her more than just his name and protection. He had given her the confidence to navigate these waters with grace, to accept their overtures without bitterness, and to forgive their past blindness without forgetting the lessons it had taught her. Throughout the evening, as she danced with Alexander's friends, received the congratulations of peers who would soon be family, and watched her future husband command the room with an authority softened by the frequent glances he sent her way, Margaret felt the last vestiges of the frightened wallflower she had been slip away like a discarded cloak. Replaced by a woman who knew her own worth, not because society had finally validated it, but because one man's love had given her the courage to claim it for herself. And when Alexander appeared at her side during a break in the dancing to announce to the assembly that he counted himself the most fortunate man in England to have won Miss Ashworth's hand, his voice carrying to every corner of the ballroom with conviction that brooked no argument, Margaret stood tall beside him, no longer the girl who had hidden in shadows, but a woman preparing to step into the light as the next Duchess of Ravenscroft, secure in the knowledge that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, bound not by duty or convenience, but by a love that had grown from the most unlikely beginning into something strong enough to reshape both their worlds. May 20th, 1815, found Margaret sitting before her dressing table at 10 in the morning, her hands trembling as she attempted to fasten her mother's pearl necklace around her throat. The wedding gifts scattered across every surface of her childhood bedroom, serving as tangible reminders that in less than a fortnight she would become the Duchess of Ravenscroft, a title that still felt as foreign on her tongue as the weight of the magnificent sapphire engagement ring on her finger. Lady Catherine bustled about the room, directing the maids in packing Margaret's trousseau while maintaining a steady stream of advice about managing a ducal household, wisdom that Margaret only half heard through the fog of anxiety that had been building since she woke at dawn, her mind racing with fears about disappointing Alexander, about proving Lady Diana and her ilk correct in their predictions of her inadequacy, about the terrifying intimacy of marriage to a man who had already buried one wife. A knock at the door interrupted her spiraling thoughts, and Alexander himself entered, having charmed his way past propriety and her mother's protests, his presence immediately filling the feminine space with his particular blend of authority and tenderness. And Margaret watched in the mirror as he approached, his reflection joining hers in the glass as he placed his hands gently on her shoulders, stilling her fumbling attempts with the necklace clasp. "Allow me," he murmured, taking the pearls from her nerveless fingers and fastening them with practiced ease before meeting her eyes in the mirror, his expression softening as he recognized the fear she was trying so desperately to hide. And without a word to Lady Catherine, who had frozen mid-instruction at his unprecedented invasion of her daughter's bedroom, He drew Margaret to her feet and guided her toward the window seat, where they had a modicum of privacy. "Tell me," he commanded gently, settling beside her and taking her cold hands in his warm ones, his thumbs stroking over her knuckles in that soothing rhythm she had come to depend upon. And Margaret found the words tumbling out, her fears about the wedding night, about managing his household, about the possibility that he might wake one day and realize his mistake, that she was not the graceful duchess he deserved, but merely the overlooked spinster he had inexplicably elevated beyond her station. Alexander listened without interrupting, his face grave as he absorbed her litany of anxieties. And when she finally ran out of words and sat breathing heavily with the effort of confession, he lifted one hand to cup her cheek, turning her face toward his with infinite gentleness before speaking in a voice roughened with emotion. "My darling Margaret, do you truly believe I chose you by mistake? That my love for you is some temporary madness that will pass with time, when every day I wake grateful beyond measure that you had the courage to confront me that night on the terrace, to show me the fire beneath your quiet exterior, to teach me that worth has nothing to do with society's shallow measurements and everything to do with the beauty of a soul that shines through even the darkest moments of dismissal and loneliness." His words washed over her like warm rain on parched earth, and Margaret felt tears spill down her cheeks as he continued, "As for the wedding night, my love, we shall discover that joy together with all the patience and tenderness you deserve, for you are not my second choice or my settling for less, but my heart's true home, the woman who has taught me to love again when I thought that part of me had died forever. And if you think I would risk losing you now over something as trivial as which fork to use at dinner, or whether you remember every guest's proper form of address, then you have not yet understood the depth of my devotion." Lady Catherine, who had been pretending to busy herself with the trousseau, but was clearly listening to every word, discreetly dabbed at her eyes with her handkerchief as Alexander sealed his vow by pressing his lips to Margaret's forehead, a benediction that seemed to calm the storm within her. And when he finally pulled back, his own eyes suspiciously bright, he added with a touch of his familiar humor, "Besides, Mrs. Pemberton has managed my household for 20 years, and would be quite offended if you tried to usurp her authority too quickly, so you shall have ample time to learn the role while she guards her territory like a dragon with its hoard," which startled a watery laugh from Margaret, and reminded her that beneath the Duke's sometimes intimidating presence was the man who had knelt in her garden at dawn, who had faced down society's censure to claim her hand, who even now was taking time from the pressing businesses of his estates to soothe her fears with a patience that spoke of true partnership rather than mere obligation. June 1st, 1815, dawned bright and clear, the morning sun streaming through the stained glass windows of St. George's Church in Hanover Square, painting rainbow patterns across the stone floor where Margaret stood in the vestry, her hands steady now as her mother adjusted the delicate lace veil that had been worn by 3 generations of Ashworth brides, the ancient fabric carrying the weight of tradition and blessing into this moment that still felt like a dream, even as the organ music swelled in the sanctuary beyond. The ivory silk wedding gown, a creation of the finest modiste in London, fell in elegant lines from the high empire waist, embroidered with tiny seed pearls that caught the light with her every breath, and Margaret marveled at how the woman in the looking-glass bore so little resemblance to the overlooked spinster who had sat alone at Lady Hastings' ball just 6 weeks ago, though the transformation went far deeper than mere clothing or circumstance. Her father appeared in the doorway, his weathered face alight with pride, and something that looked suspiciously like tears, offering his arm with a formality that couldn't quite hide the tremor in his voice as he said, "My dear girl, the Duke awaits, and I do believe he may spontaneously combust if we delay much longer." Which drew a nervous laugh from Margaret and helped ease the butterfly wings beating against her ribcage as they moved toward the nave doors. The church was full to overflowing, every member of the ton seemingly determined to witness the union that had set tongues wagging for weeks. But as the doors opened and Margaret began her walk down the aisle, she saw none of them, her entire focus drawn to the man standing at the altar, Alexander magnificent in his dark blue coat with gold buttons, his cravat tied to perfection. But it was the expression on his face that stole her breath and steadied her steps, for he looked at her as if she were the answer to every prayer he had never dared voice, his eyes bright with unshed tears and a smile so tender it made her heart contract with the force of her love for him. The walk seemed both endless and far too brief, each step carrying her closer to a future she had never imagined possible, past faces that had once dismissed her, but now watched with varying degrees of envy, curiosity, and genuine happiness. Lady Diana Sinclair managing to look simultaneously sour and resigned, while Philip Harrington beamed from his position as Alexander's groomsman, but all of it faded to mere background as her father placed her hand in Alexander's, and she felt the warmth of his touch anchor her to this miraculous reality. "Dearly beloved," the bishop began, his sonorous voice filling the sacred space, but Margaret barely heard the familiar words. Lost in the intensity of Alexander's gaze as he held her hands with gentle firmness, his thumbs tracing those soothing circles she had come to rely upon. And when the time came to speak their vows, his voice rang clear and strong, each promise weighted with the kind of certainty that comes from having faced loss and choosing to risk the heart again, while her own response, though quieter, carried no less conviction, for she knew with bone-deep certainty that this man had seen her truly when the rest of the world had looked through her as if she were made of glass. The exchange of rings passed in a blur of golden bands and whispered promises, Alexander's hands trembling slightly as he slipped the diamond-studded wedding band onto her finger where it nestled perfectly against the sapphire engagement ring. And then the bishop was pronouncing them man and wife, giving Alexander permission to kiss his bride, and time seemed to slow as her husband, cupped her face with infinite tenderness and claimed her lips in a kiss that was both promise and proclamation, gentle enough for the sacred setting, but carrying an undercurrent of passion that sent warmth spiraling through her entire being while the congregation erupted in applause. As they turned to face the assembly as the Duke and Duchess of Ravenscroft, Margaret felt the last chains of her old life fall away, replaced not by the weight of her new title, but by the liberating knowledge that she was loved, truly and completely loved, by a man who had looked past society's verdict to see the woman she truly was. And as they walked back down the aisle together, his hand holding hers with possessive pride, she glimpsed her mother weeping openly into her handkerchief, her father standing straighter than she had seen him in years, and even some of the society matrons, who had ignored her for so long, now forced to acknowledge what Alexander had seen from the beginning, that worth has nothing to do with conventional beauty or social grace, and everything to do with the quality of a soul that shines through even the darkest nights of loneliness and rejection, a truth now sealed with sacred vows and witnessed by God and man alike, transforming the overlooked spinster into a duchess not just in name, but in the confident set of her shoulders, and the radiant joy that illuminated her face as she stepped into the June sunshine on her husband's arm, ready to begin a life she had never dared imagine, but now claimed as her divine right, earned not through birthright or beauty, but through the courage to be seen and the grace to accept love when it arrived in the most unexpected form. The summer darkness had fallen soft and warm over London, by the time the wedding carriage delivered them to Pembroke House at 10 that evening, the townhouse ablaze with welcoming lights that cast golden rectangles onto the cobbled street, where a small crowd of well-wishers had gathered despite the late hour, their cheers following Margaret and Alexander as he handed her down from the carriage with exquisite care, his touch lingering on her waist as he guided her up the front steps where Mrs. Pemberton waited with the assembled staff, all beaming at their master's obvious happiness and their new mistress's shy smile. The entry hall seemed different somehow, transformed by her new status from an intimidating display of ducal grandeur into something that felt almost like home, especially when Alexander dismissed the servants with gentle authority and led her up the marble staircase, her hand tucked securely into the crook of his arm, neither of them speaking as they climbed toward the private chambers that would now be theirs to share, the silence between them charged with an electricity that made Margaret's skin tingle with anticipation and nervousness in equal measure. The door to the master suite stood open, revealing a sitting room decorated in shades of blue and gold that complemented the bedchamber beyond, where someone, probably Mrs. Pemberton, had thoughtfully arranged white roses and lit dozens of candles that cast dancing shadows on the silk-covered walls, creating an atmosphere of intimate warmth that made Margaret's heart race even faster as Alexander turned to face her, his hands coming up to cradle her face with such tenderness that she felt tears prick at her eyes despite her joy. "My Duchess," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion as his thumbs traced the delicate lines of her cheekbones. "My beloved wife, you cannot know how many nights I lay in this room alone, convinced I would never again know the blessing of sharing it with someone who owned my heart as completely as you do, and now here you stand, more beautiful than any woman has a right to be, not because of silk or jewels, but because your soul shines through your eyes with such pure light that it takes my breath away." His words dissolved the last of her nervousness, replaced by a surge of love so powerful it made her bold, and she reached up to cover his hands with her own, turning her head to press a kiss to his palm before meeting his gaze with new-found confidence as she whispered, "Then show me, Alexander, show me what it means to be yours in every way, for I have spent so many years believing myself invisible, untouchable, unwanted, and now I want to feel everything, to know what it means to be cherished by the man who saw me when no one else would look, who found me worthy when the world declared me lacking." The groan that escaped him at her words was answer enough, and he drew her into his arms with careful reverence, his lips finding hers in a kiss that began gentle but quickly deepened into something more urgent, more demanding, as if he were trying to pour 6 weeks of restraint into this one perfect moment. And Margaret responded with equal fervor, her hand sliding up to tangle in his hair as she pressed closer, marveling at how right it felt to be held like this, to be wanted like this, to know that she had the power to make this strong, controlled man tremble with desire. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Alexander rested his forehead against hers and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "I want to memorize every moment of this night, to worship every inch of you with the devotion you deserve, to erase every memory of feeling unwanted with proof of how desperately I need you. For you are not just my wife, Margaret. You are my redemption, my second chance at happiness, my proof that God sometimes saves the best gifts for those who wait." His words were punctuated by gentle touches as he began to remove the pins from her hair with infinite patience, letting the dark curls tumble free while she stood perfectly still, mesmerized by the intensity of his focus, the way his hands trembled slightly as he worked, and when her hair finally fell loose around her shoulders, He buried his face in it and inhaled deeply, murmuring words of praise that made her blush even as they filled the empty places in her heart that had been carved out by years of neglect and dismissal. The rest of their clothing disappeared slowly, each reveal accompanied by whispered endearments and gentle explorations that built the fire between them to an almost unbearable intensity. Until finally they tumbled onto the vast bed together, skin against skin, hearts beating in synchronized rhythm as they discovered the profound joy of complete unity. And when the ultimate moment arrived, when they truly became one flesh, Margaret understood at last what it meant to be seen, known, cherished, and claimed by someone who valued her, not despite her supposed flaws, but because of the unique soul that inhabited her much dismissed form. And as Alexander held her afterward, both of them trembling with the force of what they had shared, she knew that no amount of past loneliness could diminish the perfect rightness of this moment, this union, this love that had transformed them both from broken, lonely souls into something complete and whole and radiantly alive. The morning sun of June 15th, 1815, streamed through the breakfast-room windows of Pembroke House, illuminating the cozy domestic scene that had become Margaret's new reality, where she sat across from Alexander at the intimate round table they had chosen to use instead of the formal dining room. Her husband's face relaxed and content as he read aloud amusing passages from the morning papers, while she buttered his toast exactly the way he preferred it, with just a thin layer spread to the very edges. These small intimacies of married life filling her with a quiet joy that surpassed even the grandest moments of their wedding day 2 weeks prior. The transformation in their daily routines had been both subtle and profound, from the way Mrs. Pemberton now deferred to Margaret on all household matters with genuine respect rather than the polite skepticism she had shown during the engagement, to the manner in which Alexander's valet Jenkins had begun laying out her husband's clothing with extra care, knowing that his master's happiness depended largely on the approval in his duchess's eyes, and Margaret found herself settling into her role with an ease that would have astonished the overlooked spinster who had sat alone at countless social events. The Morning Post arrived with its usual stack of invitations, which Margaret sorted through with growing confidence, no longer intimidated by the cream-colored cards that had once represented evenings of painful invisibility. For now each event was an opportunity to appear on Alexander's arm, to dance every dance if she wished, to engage in conversations where her opinions were not only welcomed but sought after, the same hostesses who had barely acknowledged her existence now eager to secure the Duke and Duchess of Ravenscroft's presence at their gatherings. Alexander looked up from his newspaper, catching her small smile as she read through a particularly obsequious note from Lady Pemberton, who had spent years treating Margaret as little more than animated furniture at her musical evenings, and his eyes crinkled with shared amusement as he said, "I do hope you plan to accept that one, my dear, if only so I can watch her grovel a bit more thoroughly," which drew a laugh from Margaret that still surprised her with its freedom, for she had learned that she need never hide her true reactions from this man who delighted in every facet of her personality. The remainder of their morning followed what had become a cherished pattern, with Alexander retreating to his study to handle estate business, while Margaret met with Mrs. Pemberton to review household accounts and plan menus, tasks that might have seemed mundane, but filled her with satisfaction as tangible proof of her new position. And when she suggested changes to modernize certain practices or showed kindness to the younger servants, who reminded her of her own years of being overlooked, she saw approval and even pride in the older woman's eyes. At precisely 2 o'clock, as had become their custom, Alexander appeared in the doorway of her private sitting room, where she was responding to correspondence, his presence filling the space with warmth as he crossed to where she sat at her escritoire and pressed a kiss to the crown of her head, murmuring, "Come walk with me in the garden, Duchess mine. for I find I cannot concentrate on ledgers when the sun is shining and you are not beside me." And she rose without hesitation, abandoning her letters to take his offered arm. The garden had become their sanctuary, the place where they could speak freely without concern for listening servants or the weight of their public roles. And as they strolled among the blooming roses, Alexander shared his plans for the autumn, which included a visit to his principal estate in Derbyshire, describing the beauty of the peaks and valleys with such enthusiasm that Margaret could almost see them, though what touched her most was his repeated use of we and our, each plural pronoun a small affirmation that her solitary existence had truly ended. Their circuit of the garden was interrupted by the arrival of Philip Harrington, who had taken to dropping by with increasing frequency, drawn as much by Margaret's intelligent conversation as by his long-standing friendship with Alexander, and she was struck again by how naturally she had been absorbed into her husband's life, no longer an awkward addition, but an integral part of every gathering, every decision, every moment that mattered. As evening approached, and they dressed for Lady Sinclair's soiree, Margaret stood before her mirror while her new lady's maid arranged her hair, marvelling at how the woman reflected there bore herself with such easy confidence, the deep blue silk of her gown complementing the sapphire necklace Alexander had surprised her with that morning, claiming it was a 2-week anniversary gift, though she suspected he simply enjoyed showering her with tokens of his affection, each gift accompanied by words that meant far more than any jewel. When Alexander appeared in the doorway of her dressing room, resplendent in his evening attire, his eyes darkened with appreciation as he took in her appearance, crossing to stand behind her so their eyes met in the mirror as he said, "Do you know, my darling, that you grow more beautiful with each passing day, not because of silks or sapphires, but because happiness illuminates you from within, and I thank God every morning that He allowed me to be the man who recognized the treasure that others so foolishly overlooked," his words washing over her like a benediction, healing wounds she had not even realized still exist. The carriage ride to Lady Sinclair's passed in comfortable conversation about everything and nothing, their fingers intertwined on the seat between them, and when they arrived to find the usual crush of London society, Margaret felt none of her old anxiety, only a quiet amusement at how the crowd seemed to part before them, conversation stopping mid-sentence as people observed the Duke of Ravenscroft's obvious devotion to his new Duchess, some with envy, others with genuine pleasure at witnessing such a clear love match in a world where affection in marriage was often considered an unnecessary luxury. Throughout the evening, as they moved through the glittering rooms, Margaret was conscious of Alexander's constant presence, the way he guided her with a gentle hand at her back, how he included her in every conversation, his pride in her evident to all who observed them, and when Lady Diana Sinclair herself approached with barely concealed frustration to offer congratulations through clenched teeth, Margaret felt only pity for a woman so trapped by society's shallow values that she could not recognize how empty her victories had always been. The true measure of her transformation came when young Miss Whitmore, a shy debutante who reminded Margaret painfully of herself at that age, sat alone and overlooked near the potted palms, and Margaret deliberately crossed the room to engage her in conversation, drawing her into their circle, watching the girl bloom under kind attention, just as she herself had flowered under Alexander's recognition, understanding now that her position gave her the power to ensure others need never feel as invisible as she once had. And when Alexander caught her eye across the room, his smile told her he understood exactly what she was doing and loved her all the more for it, their partnership complete not just in private devotion, but in public purpose. Two souls who had found in each other not just love, but a shared vision of how to move through the world with grace, kindness, and the absolute certainty that every person possessed inherent worth, regardless of what society's superficial judgments might decree. a belief that would guide them through all the years to come, beginning with this perfect evening where the former wallflower had become not just a duchess, but a beacon of hope for all who had ever felt unseen, unwanted, or unworthy of love. The chandeliers of Lady Hastings' ballroom sparkled with the same brilliance they had displayed exactly 1 year ago. On April 15th, 1816, but Margaret Pembroke, Duchess of Ravenscroft, experienced the glittering scene from an entirely different vantage point as she stood beside her husband in the receiving line, greeting the very people who had once looked through her as if she were invisible, their eager smiles and effusive compliments washing over her with an irony that would have been bitter had she not been so utterly content with the transformation her life had undergone in the 12 months since Alexander had first noticed her sitting alone in this very room. The lavender silk she had worn that night had been replaced by an elegant gown of deep rose that complemented her complexion perfectly, the color chosen not to help her fade into the background, but to announce her presence with quiet confidence. And as she felt Alexander's hand rest possessively on the small of her back, she marveled at how natural it felt to stand beside him, as his duchess, receiving the deference that had nothing to do with her own merit and everything to do with his title, yet knowing that in private moments he deferred to her judgment with a respect that society would find shocking. Lady Diana Sinclair approached with the same sharp features and calculating eyes, but her curtsy was deep, and her tone honeyed as she murmured congratulations on what she termed their fairy tale romance, apparently having forgotten her own role in years of cruel whispers and deliberate exclusions. And Margaret found she could smile with genuine warmth, understanding now that Lady Diana's cruelty had stemmed from her own fears of insignificant skids, her own terror of being overlooked in a world that valued women only for their beauty and connections. The evening progressed with a strange sense of déjà vu as Margaret noticed another young woman sitting alone near the potted palms, her posture speaking of resignation rather than hope. And without hesitation, Margaret excused herself from a conversation with the Countess of Pemberton to approach the girl, remembering too well the pain of watching others dance, while knowing no partner would seek her out. And as she drew the startled Miss Thornhill into conversation, she caught Alexander watching her from across the room with such pride and love that her heart swelled almost painfully in her chest. The moment that truly marked the complete revolution of her circumstances came when the orchestra struck up a waltz and Alexander appeared at her elbow with perfect timing, leading her onto the dance floor, where a year ago she had sat watching others spin in each other's arms. And as they moved together with practiced ease, she became aware of a subtle change in the way he held her, a protective tenderness that went beyond their usual physical connection. And when he leaned close to whisper in her ear, his words sent a thrill through her entire being that had nothing to do with their public display and everything to do with the secret they had discovered only that morning. "I suppose I should make the announcement soon," he murmured, his breath warm against her skin as they turned in perfect harmony. "Before you begin to show and set every gossip in London speculating," and Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks even as joy bubbled up from deep within, for the morning's confirmation from the physician had transformed their already perfect union into something even more miraculous, the promise of new life growing within her, a testament to the completeness of their physical and emotional connection. The dance ended, but Alexander kept her hand in his, leading her to the raised platform where the musicians sat. And as he called for attention with the natural authority that had once intimidated her, but now felt like a shield protecting their happiness, Margaret understood that this moment would bookend their story perfectly, the same ballroom that had witnessed his cruel jest now serving as the stage for their greatest joy. And when he announced with barely controlled emotion that the Duchess of Ravenscroft was expecting their first child, the applause that erupted held genuine warmth from those who had witnessed their unconventional courtship and recognized true love when they saw it. Later, as they stood on the same terrace where she had first challenged his mockery, Alexander drew her into his arms with infinite care, as if she had suddenly become fragile, though Margaret had never felt stronger or more certain of her place in the world, and when he spoke, his voice held the same wondering tone it had carried when he first truly saw her for who she was, saying, "1 year ago, I was a fool who thought himself clever for noticing a woman sitting alone, never imagining that my cruelty would lead to my salvation, that the wallflower I mocked would become the center of my universe, the mother of my children, the only person who has ever seen past my title and wealth to the man beneath." And Margaret silenced him with a kiss that tasted of champagne and promises, understanding that their journey from mockery to devotion had been necessary for both of them. The remainder of the evening passed in a golden haze of congratulations and good wishes, but Margaret's thoughts kept drifting to the future, to the child growing beneath her heart, who would never question their worth or doubt their place in the world, who would be raised knowing that true value came not from beauty or position, but from kindness, intelligence, and the courage to see beyond society's shallow judgments. Lessons their parents had learned through pain but could now pass on through love. And as she watched Alexander accept congratulations with a joy he no longer tried to hide behind ducal reserve, she knew that their story, which had begun with such unlikely circumstances, would ripple outward through generations, proof that sometimes the most beautiful flowers are those that bloom in unexpected places, tended by gardeners who recognize their worth when others see only weeds. The winter afternoon light of December 20th, 1816, filtered softly through the frost-etched windows of the nursery at Pembroke House, casting delicate patterns across the pale yellow walls that Margaret had chosen specifically for their warmth and cheerfulness, while she sat in the cushioned rocking chair near the fireplace, cradling the miracle that had arrived just 6 hours earlier after a labor that had tested every ounce of her strength but resulted in the most perfect reward imaginable. A daughter whose tiny features already showed hints of Alexander's aristocratic nose and what might become her own determined chin, though for now little Lady Catherine Elizabeth merely slept with the absolute trust that only newborns possess, her miniature fist wrapped around Margaret's finger with surprising strength. Alexander had barely left her side throughout the ordeal, defying all conventions about fathers remaining distant from such female mysteries, holding her hand through the worst of the pains and whispering encouragements that ranged from tender endearments to desperate prayers, and even now he hovered nearby, having dismissed the nurse's suggestion that he retire to his study, instead pulling a chair close to the rocker where he could watch both his wife and daughter with an expression of such naked wonder that it made Margaret's heart constrict with love every time she glanced at him. The transformation in her husband over the past months of her pregnancy had been remarkable to witness, the cool reserve that had once defined the Duke of Ravenscroft melting away layer by layer as he spoke to her growing belly each evening, made lists of potential names with the same attention he gave to estate management, and drove the household staff to distraction with his constant concerns about her comfort, her health, her every slight discomfort treated as a matter of utmost urgency. And through it all, Margaret had discovered new depths to their connection, understanding now that his earlier cynicism had been armor against a world that had taken his first wife in childbed, leaving him terrified of loving again, yet unable to resist the pull she had exerted on his carefully guarded heart. The door opened quietly to admit Mrs. Pemberton, who had become as much friend as housekeeper over the months, carrying a tray with the strengthening broth cook had prepared, her weathered face soft with genuine affection as she gazed upon the scene. And Margaret knew that the entire household had been holding its collective breath since her pains began the previous evening. Their relief at a safe delivery rippling through the servants' hall with a joy that spoke to how completely she had won their loyalty, not through demanding it, but by treating each of them as individuals worthy of respect and consideration. Philip Harrington had already sent word that he would visit tomorrow, eager to meet his goddaughter and tease Alexander about how fatherhood would complete his transformation from cynical duke to devoted family man. And Margaret smiled, thinking of how their friend had become almost a brother to her, one of many relationships that had blossomed once she emerged from the shadows of society's disregard. For it seemed that, in finding love, she had also found the confidence to forge genuine connections with others who appreciated her intelligence, her quiet humor, her ability to see beyond surfaces to the heart of things. The baby stirred slightly, making small mewing sounds that immediately had Alexander on his feet, leaning over them both with concern, until Margaret laughed softly and assured him that such noises were perfectly normal, that their daughter was simply adjusting to this bright new world, so different from the warm darkness she had known. And as she guided the infant to nurse for the first time, she marveled at how natural it felt. This role she had never dared imagine for herself when she had been the overlooked spinster, resigned to a lifetime of watching others live the dreams she had learned not to voice even in the privacy of her own thoughts. Outside the windows, snow began to fall in fat, lazy flakes, blanketing the garden where Alexander had knelt in the dawn mist to declare his love, covering the rose bushes that would bloom again in spring with their promise of renewal and growth. And Margaret thought how fitting it was that their child should arrive with the winter snow, a season of apparent dormancy that held within it all the potential of the coming year, just as she herself had contained untapped depths that only needed the right circumstances to flourish into their full glory. Alexander moved to add another log to the fire, his movements careful not to disturb the peaceful tableau, then returned to his chair, where he reached out to stroke the downy fuzz, covering their daughter's head with one finger, his touch infinitely gentle as he whispered, "She is perfect, my darling Margaret, absolutely perfect, just like her mother." And Margaret felt tears slip down her cheeks, not of sadness but of completion, understanding that every moment of loneliness, every cruel whisper, every dance spent watching from the walls had been necessary steps on the path that led to this moment, this room, this love that encompassed not just the two of them, but now this tiny being who would grow up knowing only that she was cherished, valued, seen for exactly who she was meant to be. The sound of church bells drifting across the snowy afternoon reminded her that soon word would spread throughout London society that the Duke and Duchess of Ravenscroft had been blessed with a daughter, and she could already imagine the visits, the gifts, the speculation about whether the child would inherit her mother's intelligence or her father's commanding presence. But for now, in this quiet moment with just the three of them and the gently falling snow, Margaret wanted nothing more than to freeze time, to hold this perfect happiness close before sharing it with a world that had once dismissed her as unworthy of notice. And as Alexander began to hum a lullaby she recognized from their evenings together, his deep voice creating a rumbling undertone to the crackling fire, she closed her eyes and let gratitude wash over her for the unlikely journey that had brought a mocking duke to his knees in her garden and transformed them both into people capable of creating and nurturing new life, new love, new hope for all the overlooked souls who might one day find their own Alexander, their own recognition, their own happy ending that surpassed even their wildest dreams. For if Margaret Ashworth could become a beloved duchess and mother, then truly anything was possible for those brave enough to demand to be seen, to be valued, to be loved for exactly who they were. And as little Catherine Elizabeth slept on, unaware of the profound love surrounding her, Margaret knew that their story, which had begun with such pain, would echo through generations as proof that sometimes the most beautiful love stories begin in the most unexpected ways, with mockery transformed to devotion, loneliness transformed to connection, and resignation transformed to a joy so complete it could only be measured in the peaceful breathing of a newborn child and the steady presence of a man who had learned to kneel before the true worth of a woman the world had overlooked. My dear listener, as I close this tale of Margaret and Alexander, I find myself thinking of you, sitting perhaps in your car during a long commute, or curled in bed seeking escape from a day that felt too heavy, or walking alone through streets where you feel invisible to those who pass by. And I want you to know that their story, though set in ballrooms and gardens of a long-ago England, carries truths that transcend time and place. For we all know what it feels like to be overlooked, to sit on the edges of life watching others dance while we convince ourselves we are content merely to observe, to build walls of resignation around our hearts, because hope seems too dangerous when disappointment has become our most faithful companion. Yet Margaret's journey from that lonely chair by the potted palms to the nursery where she cradled her daughter speaks to something eternal in the human spirit, the capacity to bloom even after years of dormancy, to find love even after abandoning hope, to discover that sometimes the very qualities that make us feel different or less than are actually the seeds of our greatest strength, waiting only for someone perceptive enough to recognize their value. And if a duke who began with mockery could learn to kneel in a garden at dawn, if a woman dismissed by society as a spinster could become a beloved wife and mother, then perhaps the limitations we accept for ourselves are not as fixed as we believe. Perhaps the voices that whisper we are too old, too plain, too quiet, too much or not enough are merely fears dressed up as facts. And the truth is that love and recognition can arrive at any moment, often from the most unexpected sources, transforming not just our circumstances, but our very understanding of who we are and what we deserve. For Margaret did not become worthy of love when Alexander noticed her. She was always worthy, always valuable, always deserving of being truly seen and cherished, just as you are, right now, exactly as you are, with all your perceived flaws and secret dreams and the quiet strength you show every day just by continuing to hope. And I share this story not merely as entertainment, but as a reminder that wallflowers can become duchesses, that mockery can transform into devotion, that the very experiences that hurt us most deeply can become the doorways to our greatest joy. If only we remain open to the possibility that our story is not yet finished, that the best chapters may be yet to come. And so I invite you, dear listener, to join our little community of dreamers and believers, to subscribe if these words have touched something in your heart, to remember that every love story that seems like a fairy tale was once two imperfect people choosing to see past surfaces to the truth beneath, choosing courage over comfort, choosing to believe they deserved more than crumbs when a feast was possible. And as you go forward from this moment, may you carry with you Margaret's defiance, Alexander's transformation, and the absolute certainty that somewhere in this vast world there are people who will see your true worth, who will kneel in whatever garden you tend, who will love not despite your differences but because of them. For you, dear listener, are the protagonist of your own story, and it is never too late for new chapters to begin, for love to arrive, for life to surprise you with joy you had stopped believing possible. And until we meet again in another tale of transformation and triumph, remember that you are seen, you are valued, and you are worthy of every happiness that your brave heart dares to imagine.